Enemy at the gates, Operation Star. Still going strong and finally poised. Last turn we saw these Russians make it across the Donets River and establish a small bridgehead. There were 3 Russian units, those 2, and one was where that 558 SS unit is, but that one got wiped out in an overrun. It got DG'd, I think by a hip shot from the German Air Force, and then overrun. However, the Germans then had some very bad luck. There was a very weak armoured unit in this hex. It was one of these 424 tank battalions. Yes, tank battalions, and it was flipped over to its sort of 216 side, so it was very weak. They had about 3 goes at hip shotting it and failed, and in one of those it actually shot down some planes. Its flak roll was sufficient to shoot down some Ju-88 dive bombers. So the Germans then fired some artillery at it with these rockets and artillery here, and rolled so high that they killed it. I think they got a half result and then rolled a 5 or 4 or whatever and killed this unit. The trouble with that being that these 2 SS units then couldn't attack it and advance after combat into the hex, so it just left the hex empty. And when the Russians won the initiative at the beginning of turn 4, they happily walked straight back into the vacant hex with a lot more and tougher stuff. So the Russians have a bridgehead now across the river here, which is actually fairly well defended. As well defended as they can imagine. What have they got? As they can probably manage at the moment. They've got a 734 Guard Cavalry and a 412 Guard Infantry, and of course that. Sorry, it's Guard Cavalry, but of course if that doesn't get beaten up, then it can flip to its other side next turn, and it's a 845. So there's 11 factors and 4 AR in there at the moment, which is reasonably tasty. And back here, only 6. 6 with a 3 AR. They also have the advantage of being in woods, both of these hexes, so it's close terrain for defending them against artillery, and it negates armour and mech multipliers as well, so it's good defensive terrain for them, and they're going to be quite hard to dislodge, not least because if the Russians manage to keep pressure along the line, as they are trying to do, the Germans have very few spare areas where they can take troops to swing round here to try and win this battle. So if they start moving stuff around, they just leave gaps for other things to slip into, and that's exactly what the situation the Russians were trying to create, forcing the Germans into this situation where they had enough pressure on that if the Germans leave one area, leave a hex vacant, then they've got something that can just slide across into it. That's the situations that the Germans are now facing. The other problem they have is that up here, they had that DG'd unit. The Russians took a big gamble here. That DG'd unit there got hit by this artillery, but was still a 753 Grossdeutschland motorised infantry. The the Russians were attacking across the river, and at the time both of these units were DG'd as well. I think, fairly sure. Yes, I'm fairly sure they were. If they weren't both, two of the three attacking units anyway were DG'd out of this and this 13-3 here. However, they didn't get surprised and they rolled nice and high on their attack roll, and it was an option either way. The Großdeutschland motorised didn't fancy dying for no point, so retreated. The Russians were able to take the loss on this guard infantry and force their way across the river with their mech and this infantry here. And so they are currently in possession of the 3 hexes to the west of the Donets that they require to win. The Germans are not short of quality, but are going to have to take some risks and rely on some high action ratings to get them some surprise and some combats, so that they can fight back some of these incursions without leaving other hexes undefended. The big advantage they do have is way over here. The rest of the Totenkopf SS division has just arrived with their regular supply. So they have a stack of very, very mean stuff in here, and it's all in move mode, but if I were to flip it up to its combat side, this is scary stuff in here. Let's have a look. 846 armour, 746 assault guns, 958 armour. This is the kind of quality that the Germans have got sitting around on the board. 1058, 958, 746, 846. Viciously effective artillery, probably 26 strength points of artillery, 26 strength artillery, and even the motorised infantry will be hideously good. 843, not the best, but still, you know, the Russians wouldn't mind a few more 843 units kicking around. So that's what's arriving, along with Rouse here, a 10-0 leader. So this is basically the force that the Germans have spare to try and knock back any incursions. So I imagine that the Germans will be aiming that. The rest of their division is here already. You can see SST. So this is the way the Totenkopf have come already, and the rest of the division will be aiming to come back here and try and force these Russians back across the river. But I think this is going to go to the final turn and right down to the wire, and it's really hanging in the balance, and we'll see what the SS can do, and secondly what happens when the Germans get super aggressive with their air force and throw everything they've got at the Russians to try and force them back with some air power as well.
The Germans responded aggressively to Russian incursions across the river. In this central section here, the Russians were caught in a pincer between the Großdeutschland coming from the south and the SS coming from the north. That wiped out an armoured brigade and sent the straggling remnants of a Russian guard infantry division streaming back across the river in disarray. You can see it under that DG counter, and the river was reclaimed. Heavy artillery or airstrikes cost the Russians an armoured brigade up in the north and a guard cavalry brigade somewhere down in this sector, and right down here in the south the fighting was the heaviest, where the SS Totenkopf attacked again into these woods, this wooded section on the west bank of the river, and the guards cavalry, their support had been wiped out by artillery strikes, but the guards cavalry and airstrikes, but the guards cavalry put up a good fight in withdrawal and destroyed a battalion of the recon battalion of the SS Totenkopf while being forced back. So there are still holes for the Russians to infiltrate in this sector coming into the last few days of the campaign. So everything's still up for grabs here at Kharkov in Operation Star. Opportunities for the Russians still to cling on to a win, and they have one initiative coming into this final turn, so they have an opportunity to take the hexes that they need and try and hold them against what is likely to be an extremely vicious German counterattack. Let's see what they can do. Well, I've been experimenting with a second sheet of Perspex held over the board with quite a lot of D6s to protect it from the worst excesses of my cats. But and it has worked pretty well, I have to say. But one of them just ran straight into this, skidded across the top sheet of Perspex, and everything went flying. Everything went flying. Look at this. So it's just an absolute shambles. I'm wondering if I've got enough captured on video to be able to put it back together again, because the counter density wasn't exactly high. So it's possible. But yeah, that's just really disappointing. I'll see what I can do after I have a look over what video footage I've got and try and piece something together, I suppose. But it's going to be really hard to know exactly what was under DG counters, or you know, even if you've got a 2-unit stack or a 3-unit stack, it becomes pretty tough to guess how everything was laid out. So I think this may be it. I think we don't find out how Operation Star ends, unfortunately, and it was building up into a really nice conclusion as well. But God damn it. Well, I had a look at the film and I really didn't like the look of trying to recreate the board state from that. It would have taken a disproportionate amount of effort to play the remaining turn. I think the only fair result is at this point is to call it a draw, simply because it's the Russians still had chances, I thought. possibly even good chances. Without ever playing it out, I'll never know. But they were certainly in a strong enough position to be worth a draw. Had they not even had a foothold across the Donets, and there'd been strong German presence everywhere that they could get to, then I'd have called it a German win. And obviously, had they had if they'd had the victory hexes that they required coming into that turn, I'd have called it a Russian win. But in the absence of either of those things, with it still completely undecided, I'm going to call Operation Star with a draw. Still pretty gutted that it all fell apart, but my cat protection has worked throughout the week pretty well. So I'm hoping that this was an exceptional piece of skill that one of my little fuckers managed to pull off to destroy the game. And onward, I think reluctant enemies might come back to the table, and I'll see whether I can get any more turns into that before it all gets ripped to pieces by a little monster. Anyway, Operation Star.